Deep in the heart of an isolated forest, surrounded by towering pines and dense fog, lay Shady Creek Village, a place with an unsettling history whispered among nearby towns. It was a village frozen in time, where the houses leaned like old men weary of holding up the past, and the streets were worn from centuries of use. The village had only a few inhabitants left, those too poor or stubborn to leave. They knew the stories, but no one spoke them aloud anymore. Even the bravest visitors never stayed long. The curse began long ago, in the 18th century, when the village was prosperous, filled with traders, craftsmen, and families. At the time, a mysterious traveler came through, a man dressed in black robes, with hollow eyes that seemed to peer into the soul. He knocked on every door, seeking shelter for the night, but the villagers, suspicious of strangers, turned him away. As the sun set, the traveler reached the final house, a modest cabin at the edge of the village, where an old widow named Agnes lived. Kind and compassionate, she let him in without hesitation. That night, the traveler revealed his true form. He was a warlock, a sorcerer exiled from distant lands, and he cursed the village for its cruelty. "None of you shall ever rest," he declared, his voice rising like a storm. "The sins of your ancestors will haunt you for eternity. Your children, their children, and those who follow will be bound to this place, never to know peace." The curse took hold the very next day. Crops withered, livestock died, and sickness spread. The villagers tried to flee, but a thick fog rolled in from the forest, trapping them inside. Every path out of Shady Creek led them back to the village square, no matter how far they walked. They were prisoners of their own home. As the years passed, strange things began happening. Some nights, villagers heard whispers in the wind, their names being called from the shadows. Others saw figures at the edge of the forest, pale, gaunt beings with eyes that glowed like embers. Worst of all were the disappearances. Children who went missing were found days later, their faces frozen in silent screams, their bodies cold as ice. No one knew where they had been taken, or by what. In present times, the village is a ghost town, except for a few stubborn souls who remain. Among them is an old man named Elias, who remembers the stories his grandparents told him. He recalls how every full moon, something stirs in the village. Windows rattle, doors creak, and those brave enough to walk the streets feel an overwhelming sense of dread, as though something unseen is watching them. One night, a group of urban explorers, intrigued by the legends of Shady Creek, decided to visit. They were skeptical, laughing off the stories as nothing more than local folklore. Armed with flashlights and cameras, they arrived just before dusk, setting up camp near the abandoned village hall. As the night wore on, the forest grew unnaturally quiet. The wind stopped, and the temperature plummeted. The explorers noticed strange symbols carved into the trees, runes that no one recognized, but all agreed looked ominous. Then came the voices. Faint at first, like whispers carried on the breeze, then louder, insistent, as though the very ground was speaking to them. "Leave, now." One by one, their flashlights began to flicker, casting eerie shadows that twisted and writhed. Suddenly, the leader of the group, Sarah, screamed. She had caught a glimpse of something in the distance, a figure standing at the edge of the village, cloaked in black. His eyes were glowing red, just like in the old stories. The warlock had returned. Panic set in as the group tried to leave, but no matter which direction they ran, they found themselves back at the village square, just like the cursed villagers centuries before. The fog had returned, thick and suffocating, swallowing their cries for help. One of the explorers, Mark, claimed to see movement in the fog, children, with hollow eyes and skeletal hands, reaching out for them. Hours passed, though it felt like an eternity. The group was disoriented, exhausted, and terrified. It was then that the whispers came again, this time louder and clearer. The price must be paid. Sarah, in her desperation, stumbled into an old house, the same cabin where Agnes had taken in the warlock centuries ago. The air inside was thick with a foul stench, and the walls seemed to pulse with life. At the center of the room stood an altar, ancient and covered in dust. Sarah could feel the eyes of the village upon her, though she was alone. Desperate, she grabbed a rusted knife lying on the altar, not knowing why. As she did, the whispers became deafening. She heard Elias' voice in her mind, a warning from days past, only a sacrifice can break the curse. Before she could react, the other members of the group appeared in the doorway, their faces pale, eyes wide with terror. One by one, they began to speak in unison, their voices not their own. The curse cannot be undone. The village will take what it is owed. Sarah turned to run, but the door slammed shut behind her. The walls of the house groaned, and the floor began to crack open. From the depths of the earth came the sound of wailing, the cries of generations trapped in eternal torment. The fog seeped into the house, and with it came the figures, those lost to the curse long ago. Their hands reached out, cold and bony, pulling the explorers into the ground, one by one. Sarah's scream was the last sound to echo through Shady Creek that night. By morning, the fog had lifted, and the village was silent once more. The explorers were never seen again, their equipment left behind, abandoned in the village square. The curse of Shady Creek remained unbroken, its secrets buried with the souls of those foolish enough to seek them. But the village still waits, waiting for the next visitors, for the next sacrifice. And in the wind, if you listen closely, you can still hear the whispers. The price must be paid.